So I'm going to read you Chalmers' statement regarding first-person data.
Yeah.
I take it for granted that there are first-person data. It's a manifest fact about our minds that there is something it is like to be us, that we have subjective experiences, and that these subjective experiences are quite different at different times. Would you say so far so good?
Yes, but I'm already getting out my highlighter and my red pen, but go ahead.
Our direct knowledge of subjective experiences stem from our first-person access to them, and subjective experiences are arguably the central data that we want a science of consciousness to explain.
There's a sense in which that's right, and there's a sense in which it's wrong. We have, in some regards, remarkably limited access. I think he uses the word access there. Yeah, let's go back and
our first-person access to them.
First-person access. Our first-person access to our own thoughts is actually, you might say, underprivileged. We know next to nothing about how it works or what it deals with. Compare it with our first-person access through our eyes with the outside world. Here's something we know. We know if we close our eyes, suddenly we've lost all that access. Open our eyes, boom, we've got it back. So we know something. We know that the eyes are involved. You know, you have to learn that sort of thing. Now, with regard to what's happening subjectively, that's what we're inboard of the eyeballs. We don't know. We direct attention to things. How do we do that? We don't know. How do we, when we do direct our attention to something, what is the process that gives us convictions about what we're seeing or experiencing when we direct our attention? I mean, let's walk through a very simple case. Think about your left big toe right now. I mean, don't think about it. See if you can get some sensation from it. See if you can get an experience of your left big toe now. Now, did you press a little bit with your toe to make sure that you were getting it, or did it just come? Yeah, you sort of don't know, but you think you know how to follow that direction, but you don't know how you do it. And if I ask you to think about Montreal, you know you can do it, but you don't know how you do it. How do you know you're succeeding in thinking about Montreal? Well, because I'm thinking right now about my house in Montreal. How do you know? How do you know? The fact is that you are in a privileged position to answer questions about what you're thinking about. Questions I ask you, or that you ask yourself. But beyond that, beyond having access to the contents of your thought, the machinery is simply not available to you at all. It is as distant from you as what's happening in your gallbladder or in your lungs. You may have better access to that, in fact, in some regards, than you do to what's going on in your brain. If a teacher says, "Use your brain," how? What am I supposed to do? She says, "Use your kidney." The brain is, if anything, more mysterious than the kidney. big mistake that people make is trying to exempt the subject. Keep postponing the first person. Keep postponing and say, well, that's for tomorrow. That's, I'm not working on the hard problem now. I'm just working on everything leading up to the hard problem.
Even just right at the outset, when you start thinking about consciousness, every question that arises because there's a subject in there is itself suspect.
Yes.
So even the qualia problem, if you're thinking about this and you're thinking that I'm having experiences, or there's something it's like to be me, you're already under the influence of a subject that's
I think it depends on how you exploit that starting point. If you just take it as an obvious assumption, then you're doomed. If you take it as a tempting assumption that itself stands in need of either support or replacement, then you're not doomed.
Information enters through our senses. It's transduced in neurochemical code, and there's no second transduction. So spike trains all the way. But this information has to be made available to other sub-agents in the brain.
Absolutely.
It's never made available to a spectator in the Cartesian theater.
Right.
It's never made available in the medium of phenomenal representation.
Right.
What is it? What's the medium, or what's the format? What happens to the spike trains to make them then readily available for further treatment?
Well, the whole agent, the whole human being, if we're talking about a human being, has a system, somewhat anarchic, somewhat political, somewhat cooperative, of interacting parts that are constantly fighting for control. And learning self-control is a part of growing up and maturing. And in infants and small children, we see very limited self-control. But in adults like us, self-control is pretty well standard operating procedure. So you've got a control system in your brain which determines what you do next, what you think about next, what you try to do next, and so forth. That control system feeds on these higher level representations coming both from the outside world and from inside. So there's, if you like, your stream of consciousness. All these contents vying for influence in this tug of war with multiple forces at work, and some things establishing hegemony, power, clout for a while, and then in the process laying down memory traces so that they can be retrieved. They have enough power to reassert themselves under some conditions, and so forth. And so it goes. And a lot of things just evaporate, just vanish into the ether, if you like, without registering, without becoming even a little bit famous in the brain. And this is fame in the brain. This is or clout. It's a process by which contents are entertained by the whole system.
This information, you mentioned somewhere that it must change into another format to be usable by other agents, and not change medium, but to be...
This is the hardest problem in cognitive science. I think this is the hard question, is how does the design get done which assures our capacity to have parts in us that can do this? From bacteria to Bach and back, I tell the story of General Leslie Groves creating the nuclear facility where they separated the plutonium for the bomb at Oak Ridge in Tennessee. And there were 10,000 people doing jobs. They didn't know what they were doing. They were kept completely in the dark about what they were doing. But what they were doing was making fissionable nuclear bomb material. A stupendous piece of design. And General Leslie Groves was the general in charge of the team. He had to understand not all the scientific details, but he had to put the whole thing together. There's no General Groves in your brain. How do all those clueless neurons and clueless neural tissues acquire the capacity to interact with each other to produce all of these amazingly coherent results? We know it's possible because it happens every day. How it is possible is a problem in no one field. It's in part a problem in artificial intelligence, and certainly people in AI are doing some of the most interesting and provocative work on this, but it's also a problem in cognitive neuroscience, and it's also a problem, I think, in evolutionary biology. Because it's got to be an evolutionary process. It's got to be a process which turns competence without comprehension into competence with comprehension. And we know in sketchy outline that A, that's possible, and B, how it's possible by multiple iterations of generate and test, of trial and error. But how brains do it is still, in detail, quite a puzzle.
Do you think, given that the cells, the neurons in our brain once roamed in the wild individually, in a sense, do you think that the idea of feral neurons going wild now is an avenue that might be explain things in psychopathology or in cognition? Or
that's a pet speculation of mine that we shouldn't underestimate the, as it were, the individuality and the agency of individual nerve cells. They are descended from little agents that fended for themselves quite well for hundreds of millions of years. And some of the talents that they inherited from their wild, free-living ancestors may be still, well, are certainly being used in new forms in their multicellular capacities today. Now, I think thinking of individual cells, not just nerve cells, thinking of individual cells as little agents that have agendas is part of the key to solving these problems. The people at Oak Ridge, those are people with lives and loved ones and agendas and histories and hopes and fears and all the rest. Very fancy agents shrunk down to do a job they didn't have to understand. The individual cells of a multicellular organism like you or me, they don't have that rich a backstory or inner life, but we ignore their individuality and their intrepidity, you might say, at our peril. I think every cell, Monod once said that, or no, I guess it was Jacob who said, the dream of every cell is to become two cells. A lovely aphorism. But of course, neurons sort of have lost that dream. They don't reproduce. The dream of every cell is to stay alive. And to stay alive, you gotta make contacts. You gotta network, and you've got to deal with the environment around you. And I think that somehow brains and the rest of bodies, but let's talk about brains, are environments where cells fend for themselves in interaction with their neighbors, and it behooves them to join forces with their neighbors and not to fight them too hard. And it's that sort of social networking that gradually builds up the powers that we can then presuppose in our models.
So you're right here, and that brings us back to the beginning of this conversation. To me, one of the most fascinating bifurcations in the intellectual world today is between those to whom it is obvious that a theory that leaves out the subject is thereby disqualified as a theory of consciousness. In Chalmers' terms, it evades the hard problem. And those to whom it is just as obvious that any theory that doesn't leave out the subject is disqualified. I submit that the former have to be wrong, but they certainly don't lack for conviction. So, given the fact that philosophers are reasonable and are looking for the truth, what explanation do you have for this great divide with respect to what seems obvious?
I think that there are several, as it were, respectable sources of these convictions, and then there's some less respectable ones. the less respectable ones are just a failure of imagination. That I think a lot of people who think you have to leave the subject in just haven't thought through what the issues really are, haven't realized that, of course, there's going to be a third-person neurophysiological theory that accounts for, everything that a living human body does. And that in doing that, it is going to explain consciousness and language and love and hate and all the rest of those good things. That theory is coming down the pike. It's hard, but there's no barrier that anybody has defined which says that it can't succeed. But I think for a lot of people, well, first there are some people for whom the obviousness of the belief that they are a self with a perspective, a first-person point of view, that fact just trumps everything. That just they can't see that they'll give up all of science if that's what it takes to hang on to that. Well, I can appreciate, I think I can understand that conviction, but I don't share it, and I think I think duly impressed with the wonderfulness of being me, but I also think that I'm a physical body of which there's a full account from the third person point of view, which will capture all the wonderfulness through it. Self-love, if I call it that, is not so great that I don't suppose that in the end there's a physical, scientific theory from the third person point of view that will explain all of the marvels that go into making me, a thinking mind, a member of the moral community, and so forth. Other people don't share that. And I do my best to convince them that it's not a tragedy if their selves turn out to be sort of useful fictions. We've got lots of useful fictions around. We've got lots of user illusions around. And it makes sense to think that part of our ability to get around so well in the world is that we have such good user illusions of ourselves. We can simplify the trillions of complications of our bodies and get down to a much more sketchy and metaphorical image of ourselves, and that's what does all the work.
Thank you, Dan. Who knows, maybe we can do it again some other time.
We'll see how this one comes out. Yeah. See if anyone aside from you and me is even interested in sitting through it.